Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, March 1945. The train platform smelled of diesel and wet prairie grass, and 15-year-old Dieter Koch stepped onto American soil with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He'd been told Americans tortured prisoners, especially the young ones. He'd been warned to expect cruelty, starvation, casual violence. Instead, an American guard handed him a chocolate bar, real chocolate, wrapped in paper that crinkled with letters he couldn't read, but a gesture he couldn't misunderstand. Dieter stared at it like it might explode. Around him, 36 other boys stood frozen in the same confusion, their oversized uniforms hanging loose on frames hollowed out by hunger. Everything they'd been taught was already crumbling, and they hadn't even left the station. Before we continue this story, please like and subscribe if you're finding the content valuable. Comment where you're watching from and share this video with anyone interested in the human stories of World War II. Your support helps us keep these forgotten moments alive. The chocolate felt heavy in Dieter's palm, heavier than the rifle he'd carried for 4 months, heavier than the lies that had brought him here. He looked at the guard's face, searching for the cruelty propaganda had promised, and found only a tired man in his 20s who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Behind him, Hans Richter whispered in German, "Either it's safe or we're already dead." Dieter tore the wrapper and tasted sweetness he'd forgotten existed. And in that moment, standing on an Oklahoma platform with chocolate melting on his tongue, he realized everything, absolutely everything, had been a lie. They'd come from the desperate final months when Germany scraped the bottom of its manpower reserves and found children. Dieter Koch was 15, from a village outside Dresden. Conscripted in November 1944 when the Reich needed BODs more than soldiers. He'd received 3 weeks of training, barely enough to operate his rifle, nowhere near enough to survive combat. He'd fired that rifle twice during the Rhine crossing in March, both shots wild and panicked, before American forces overran his position and he surrendered to men who looked almost relieved to capture someone who clearly wanted to be captured. Hans Richter was 16, tall and skeletal, from Hamburg. He'd watched his city burn from Allied bombing, had seen his neighborhood reduced to rubble and ash, and when conscription came, he'd gone without protest, because staying home meant watching death arrive slowly instead of quickly. He'd been a decent student once, had dreamed of studying engineering, had imagined a future that didn't involve uniforms in trenches and the smell of cordite. Those dreams had died somewhere between Hamburg and the Western Front, buried under propaganda and fear and the grinding reality that Germany was losing. And everyone knew it, except the officers who kept sending boys to die. Klaus Zimmermann was 14. 14. His uniform had been altered twice and still hung loose on his thin frame. His baby face made American soldiers initially doubt he was military at all. But his papers were authentic Volkssturm documents from a regime desperate enough to conscript children and old men when real soldiers were gone. Klaus had been in uniform 6 weeks. He'd fired his rifle once in training and missed the target by 3 meters. Secretly, he was relieved. Hitting the target meant he might someday have to hit a person, and he wasn't sure he could live with that. The Atlantic crossing took 2 weeks in a transport ship's hold, the boys seasick and terrified. Propaganda had been explicit. Americans tortured prisoners, especially children, to demoralize German forces. Grainy photographs and second-hand testimonies, none verifiable, had convinced them surrender meant death or worse. But the crossing contradicted everything they'd been told. They were fed regularly, nothing lavish, but more than field rations and far better than anything they'd eaten in months. The American guards were professional, even indifferent, treating the boys like logistical responsibilities rather than hated enemies. When Klaus became violently seasick, an American medic treated him with calm, routine care, offering medicine that actually helped, and checking on him twice a day. There was no cruelty, no brutality, none of the promised horrors. Instead, there was basic humanity, mundane, unremarkable, and utterly shattering to beliefs Klaus had never questioned. The train from New York to Oklahoma took 3 days and crossed a continent so vast it made Germany seem like a garden plot. Dieter pressed his face to the window whenever guards allowed it, watching America unfold in endless variations. Cities that hadn't been bombed, farms that looked prosperous, almost casual in their abundance. Civilians who moved without fear, without the constant vigilance that had defined German life for years. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and overwhelming. This was the enemy, the nation they'd been told was weak and decadent. Yet everything visible suggested strength beyond anything propaganda had prepared them for. Captain James Morrison stood on the Tonkawa platform watching the boys descend and felt profoundly uncomfortable. He was 38, had 2 sons roughly the same age as these prisoners, and had spent the previous week arguing with his superiors about how to handle juvenile POWs. Their children, he'd said repeatedly. The response had been bureaucratic. They're enemy combatants who wore uniforms and carried weapons. Treat them according to Geneva Conventions and use judgment about age-appropriate accommodations. Morrison had requested clarification about what age-appropriate meant for 15-year-old prisoners of war. No clarification had arrived, so he'd made his own decisions. The boys would be housed separately from adult prisoners. They'd attend educational classes. They'd receive adequate nutrition and medical care. They'd be treated firmly but not harshly, with recognition that children forced into military service deserved different handling than career soldiers who'd chosen warfare. His staff had questioned these decisions, called them coddling, said they showed weakness. Morrison had overridden every objection. "We'll treat them as we'd hope our own captured sons would be treated," he'd said. "That's the standard." The chocolate bar wasn't planned. It was improvisation by Sergeant Davis, a farm boy from Kansas who'd been instructed to help with intake processing and had seen terrified children descending from a train. He'd reached into his pocket, found the Hershey bar he'd been saving, and handed it to the first boy who stepped onto the platform. Dieter's hands had shaken so badly he'd almost dropped it. The processing took 3 hours. Medical examinations, delousing showers, uniform exchange, paperwork documenting names, and captured details. The American staff conducted everything with efficient professionalism, treating the boys firmly but without cruelty, maintaining authority without inflicting degradation. The showers were private. The medical examinations were respectful. The new clothes, American prison uniforms marked with PW stencils, were clean and properly sized, as if someone had anticipated that children needed different dimensions than adult prisoners. Klaus couldn't believe the showers. Hot water, actual hot water, abundant and clean, lasting more than 30 seconds. In Germany, hot water had disappeared years ago, bathing reduced to cold sponging when water was available at all. He stood under the stream until Sergeant Davis tapped on the stall and said something in English that probably meant times. Up, Klaus dried with a towel that was rough but clean, feeling transformed by simple hygiene. Like washing away, had removed more than dirt had removed some of the fear and deprivation that had accumulated over years of war. Dr. Elizabeth Parker, the camp physician, documented what Captain Morrison had suspected: severe malnutrition bordering on starvation. Dieter was 5'7" and weighed 98 pounds. Hans was 5'10" and weighed 105. Klaus was 5'3" and weighed 84 pounds. All showed signs of vitamin deficiencies, untreated injuries, chronic exhaustion. Dr. Parker made notes that would later become part of military reports about conditions in Germany's final months, about a regime so desperate it had conscripted starving children and sent them to war without proper food or training or any chance of survival. The meal that followed exceeded anything propaganda had led them to expect: beef stew with actual beef, bread with butter, real butter, not the synthetic substitutes they'd grown used to. Green beans, milk, actual milk, white and cold, tasting like childhood memories from before rationing, had turned everything into scarcity and substitutes. Dieter ate slowly, his stomach protesting rich food after months of deprivation, his mind unable to process the contradiction. He'd been told Americans starved prisoners, yet here was abundance. He'd been told Americans tortured children, yet here was mercy. Hans ate mechanically, his tall frame needing calories, even as his mind struggled to accept their source. He kept thinking about propaganda sessions where officers had shown photographs of American camps where starvation and torture were presented as documented fact. But those photographs had been grainy, unclear, possibly fabricated. This meal was concrete, undeniable, real. If propaganda had lied about this, what else had been lies? The question opened chasms Hans wasn't ready to explore. Klaus couldn't finish his portion. His shrunken stomach simply couldn't accommodate food his body desperately needed. He sat staring at half-eaten stew, feeling tears prick his eyes because wasting food felt like sin, because abundance felt like punishment after years of scarcity. An American cook noticed, came over, said something gentle in English, and wrapped the remaining food for Klaus to have later. The gesture was small, but overwhelming recognition that prisoners were human, that children needed care, that even enemies deserved basic compassion. The living quarters were simple but clean: wooden barracks with bunks, thin mattresses, lockers for personal items they didn't have. The windows had bars, but also screens against insects, suggesting concern for prisoner comfort beyond minimum security requirements. Someone had hung a bulletin board with camp rules translated into German, acknowledging that prisoners needed to understand expectations rather than just be punished for violations. Captain Morrison addressed them through a translator, a German-speaking corporal who'd grown up in Milwaukee's German community. The message was straightforward: "You're prisoners of war under Geneva Convention protection. You'll be treated fairly but firmly. You'll attend school, perform light work duties, receive adequate food and medical care. The war is essentially over. Germany is defeated. Your job now is to survive, maintain your health, prepare for eventual repatriation to whatever Germany becomes after Reconstruction." The words landed like physical blows. Germany is defeated. None of the boys had fully accepted that reality, despite the evidence. Surrender had been individual act, their units collapse rather than national catastrophe. But hearing it stated plainly by an American officer made it undeniable. The regime they'd been told was invincible had lost. The victory they'd been promised was myth. Everything they'd sacrificed, childhood, innocence, normalcy, had been for nothing. Dieter felt anger flash hot in his chest, not at the Americans, surprisingly, but at the regime that had lied to them, that had sent children to war, that had promised victory while planning nothing but prolonged dying. He looked around the barracks at other boys showing similar emotional cascades and wondered how many felt the same fury at being betrayed by their own leadership more completely than they'd been defeated by enemies. That evening on his bunk, Dieter tried to process the day. He'd expected beatings and received chocolate, expected starvation and received stew, expected torture and received medical care. Every expectation shaped by propaganda had been wrong. Hans, in the bunk above, whispered, "Do you think they're all like this, or did we just get lucky?" Dieter answered, "I think maybe we've been lied to about everything." Klaus lay nearby, crying softly, not from fear, but from emotional overload. 14 years old, thousands of miles from home. He'd been taught to hate the people now treating him better than the regime that claimed to protect him. Morning brought an announcement that stunned them. They would attend school. Captain Morrison believed child prisoners needed education more than labor. Classes in English, math, history, and geography resumed the learning war had stolen from them. The classroom, a converted storage building with desks and maps, showed a divided Germany that no longer existed as they'd known it. Their teacher, Mrs. Sarah Thompson, whose son served in the Pacific, volunteered because she recognized they were children despite being enemies. She began with English basics. "Good morning," she said, urging them to repeat. Their accents were thick, but she smiled and tried again. Dieter found himself unexpectedly engaged, reminded of life before conscription when he dreamed of becoming an engineer. For the first time in years, he felt something like hope. Hans struggled, worn older than his 16 years, but the lessons met his true level. Resistance was exhausting, and despite himself, he participated, raising his hand, caring about correct pronunciation even while insisting he didn't care at all. Klaus thrived. Youngest and most adaptable, he absorbed English with speed that surprised Mrs. Thompson. He liked correct answers, the structure of grammar, the safety of a classroom after years of fear. Focusing on irregular verbs instead of survival felt like unimaginable luxury. Afternoons brought light work. Morrison believed productivity aided morale, but that children shouldn't do hard labor. The boys gardened, helped in the kitchen, and performed maintenance tasks that taught skills without exploitation. Dieter worked in the garden with Private Johnson, an Iowa farm boy proud of his craft. Johnson taught planting technique and crop rotation as if they were colleagues, not captor and captive. Through shared work, Dieter learned that Americans were not so different, that most soldiers were ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. Hans worked in the kitchen under Sergeant Martinez, who treated him like an apprentice. Martinez taught knife skills, kitchen management, and told Hans he had talent. The idea that he had a future and that skills learned in captivity might matter felt revolutionary. Klaus was assigned to the small camp library, organizing books under Mrs. Davis, who treated him like an assistant. German classics Goethe, Mann, Hesse waited on the shelves, authors he'd heard of but never read because they weren't ideological. By the second week, the boys were allowed one-page censored letters home. Dieter wrote simply to his mother, "I am well. The Americans treat us fairly." Hans wrote that he was surviving and learning English. Klaus wrote with childish handwriting, telling his parents he was safe and hoping to see them again. Letters went through the Red Cross. Replies would take months, if any came. But writing reminded them they had lives beyond captivity. Not everyone adapted. Werner Schmidt, 17, had absorbed ideology so deeply that American mercy felt threatening. He rejected classes and work, preaching propaganda. Morrison eventually separated him to prevent disruption. Alone, Werner's worldview collapsed. The truth forced its way in. He emerged quieter, humbled, wounded in ways that might heal. December 1945 brought their first Christmas in captivity. A tree stood in the barracks, ornaments handmade. Mrs. Thompson led German carols. The meal, turkey, potatoes, vegetables, pie was extraordinary. Before eating, Morrison addressed them. "The war is over. You survived. You have futures. This meal recognizes that you're more than prisoners. You're young men with lives ahead." Dieter felt tears sting his eyes during that speech. His father had died on the Eastern Front. His older brother had been lost at sea. He'd been conscripted at 15, had fought in a war he didn't understand for causes revealed as false. And now he sat in enemy captivity eating Christmas dinner, while an American captain told him he had a future worth hoping for. That evening, the boys gathered and sang German carol songs, connecting them to a culture deeper than the regime's poisonous 12 years. American guards listened, some joining with English versions, music briefly bridging division. It was small in the war's vastness, but for the boys, it felt transformative proof that humanity survived hatred. In spring 1946, news came. Repatriation would begin. The boys would return gradually as logistics aligned, released to families if they could be found. Captivity now had an end. Dieter received notice in April, on his last day at Camp Tonkawa. Morrison handed him a reference letter stating he'd been a model prisoner. Learned English, gained skills useful in reconstruction. "Germany will need young men like you," Morrison said. "Take what you learned and make sure your country never repeats its path." Dieter took the letter with trembling hands. "You showed us mercy," he said. "You treated us like humans. I will remember." The ship departed New York in May with 300 POs. Dieter watched America fade, thinking of chocolate bars, English classes, Christmas turkey, all the small mercies that dismantled certainties. He was returning to ruins, but carrying knowledge that enemies could be decent and that futures could rest on truth. Hans returned to Hamburg in June, finding his family barely surviving. He told them about Oklahoma and the Americans who'd shown mercy despite every reason for vengeance. His mother wept, grateful and ashamed. Germany had created such enemies. Klaus went home in September, last of the Tonkawa boys. His parents clung to him. He told them everything: the capture, the train ride, the chocolate bar, the classes, the Christmas dinner. His mother listened in tears, grateful the Americans had been kind, devastated her child had been made a soldier. Dieter lived until 2007, building a career as a civil engineer helping rebuild Dresden. Among his possessions, his children found the preserved Hershey wrapper from Tonkawa and an unsent 1985 letter to Morrison. "You treated us as humans. You showed victory can coexist with compassion. The chocolate bar, the classes, the dinner, none were required. They were choices recognizing that children were children, that mercy could plant seeds of peace." The wrapper, now in a museum, remains fragile, but its meaning endures.